Picture a woman. She is standing at the prow of a golden ship. The ship moves slowly down the river Cydnus in southern Turkey. Its sails are purple silk. Its oars are silver, dipping into the water in perfect rhythm. The smell of burning incense drifts across the water to the shore. Flutes and pipes play music so beautiful that the crowds gathering on the riverbank fall completely silent. And at the center of all of this, reclining beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite herself, is Cleopatra, the most powerful woman in the ancient world, the last pharaoh of Egypt. A woman so remarkable that 2,000 years after her death, we are still telling her story. Tonight, that story belongs to you. Before we sail into Cleopatra's world tonight, welcome. If you are new here, this is History Tales for Sleep, where the ancient world becomes your bedtime story. Every Tuesday and Friday, a new story arrives. Calm, soothing, and carefully told. If these stories help you rest, we would love for you to subscribe. So a new story is always waiting for you. And tonight, we want to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Whether it is midnight on the East Coast, or late evening on the West Coast, or the quiet early hours somewhere in Europe, you are always welcome here. Now settle in. Let your body grow heavy and warm. And let us sail together into the ancient world of the last queen of Egypt. The year is 69 BC. Alexandria, Egypt, the most magnificent city in the ancient world. Stand for a moment at its harbor and look around you. The lighthouse of Alexandria rises before you, over 100 meters tall, its fire visible 30 miles out to sea. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean crowd the harbor. Greek merchants and Roman soldiers and Arab traders and Jewish scholars and Egyptian priests move through the streets in a blur of languages and colors and smells. The streets themselves are wide and straight, planned with deliberate grandeur. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of human knowledge ever assembled, stands near the palace complex. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, gathered from every civilization that ever wrote anything down. The smell of papyrus and cedar oil and the sea is everywhere. Palm trees line the boulevards. The air is warm and salt-scented. And in the royal palace by the harbor, a child has just been born. Her parents are Ptolemy XII, the king of Egypt, and a woman whose identity history has largely lost. The child is the third of 5 children. She is a princess of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek royal house that has ruled Egypt for 2.5 centuries. She is not yet expected to be queen. She is simply a child in a palace by the sea. Her name is Cleopatra, and she will become the most famous woman in the history of the ancient world. Let your eyes close now. Let the warm Mediterranean air settle around you. The harbor lights of Alexandria flicker on the dark water. The lighthouse beam sweeps slowly across the sea, and the story of the last queen of Egypt begins to unfold, slowly and gently, in the warm dark. Chapter 1. Alexandria, the city that made Cleopatra. Time period, 331 BC, 69 BC. Key figure, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Major event, the creation of Alexandria and the Ptolemaic kingdom. What was built? The most sophisticated city in the ancient world. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand the world she was born into. And that world was Alexandria. Alexander the Great founded the city in 331 BC during his conquest of Egypt. He chose the site carefully, a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, with a natural harbor protected by a small island called Pharos. He laid out the street plan himself, reportedly using barley to mark the lines since they had no chalk. Then he left. He never returned. He died in Babylon 8 years later, at 32, before the city that bore his name had fully risen from the desert sand. But his general Ptolemy, who took Egypt as his share of the divided empire after Alexander's death, understood what Alexander had begun. Ptolemy I, called Soter, the Savior, made Alexandria his capital. He brought Alexander's body to the city and buried it in a magnificent tomb at the city's center. The tomb became a pilgrimage site and a symbol of Alexandria's connection to the greatest conqueror who had ever lived. Ptolemy I also began what would become the Library of Alexandria. His policy was simple and audacious. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was required to surrender any books it carried. The books were copied. The copies were returned to the owners. The originals were kept. By the time of Cleopatra, the library contained perhaps 700,000 scrolls. Everything the ancient world had ever written down. Homer and Plato and Aristotle. Egyptian medical texts and Babylonian astronomical observations. Indian mathematical treatises and Persian historical records. The works of playwrights and philosophers and scientists and historians from every civilization that had ever put words to papyrus or clay or vellum. All of it gathered in one place. The Library of Alexandria attracted the greatest minds of the ancient world. Euclid worked there, developing the geometric principles that students still learn today. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the earth there with remarkable accuracy, using shadows and mathematics and a deep well in southern Egypt. Archimedes came there to study. Herophilus performed the first systematic anatomical studies on human bodies there, laying the foundations of modern medicine. For a brief, brilliant period, Alexandria was the center of human knowledge. The Ptolemaic kings who followed the first Ptolemy used the city's wealth and sophistication to project an image of power and culture. They presented themselves as pharaohs to the Egyptian population, adopting the ancient titles and religious roles of the pharaohs. They built temples in the Egyptian style. They honored the Egyptian gods. But they also maintained their Greek identity, speaking Greek in the court, producing Greek literature and philosophy. Alexandria was a city of layers. Greek on the surface, Egyptian beneath, and underneath both, something entirely its own. A cosmopolitan, sophisticated, intellectually electric city that had no exact parallel anywhere in the ancient world. This was the world Cleopatra was born into. A world of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary danger. A world where knowledge was power, where language was a weapon, where beauty and intelligence and political skill were the currencies of survival. A princess in this world needed to be very good at all three. Cleopatra was extraordinary at all three. The library is very quiet tonight. The scrolls rest in their cedar shelves. The oil lamps burn low. The scholars have gone home. And the harbor lights of Alexandria shimmer on the dark water below. As you rest now, in the warm quiet, we move forward. Chapter 2. The Education of a Queen. Time period, 69-51 BC. Key figure, Cleopatra as a child and young woman. Major event, Cleopatra's education and early life. What was learned? Everything a pharaoh needed to know. Cleopatra VII was unlike any ruler who had come before her in the Ptolemaic dynasty. And the most remarkable thing about her was not her beauty, despite what 2,000 years of storytelling might suggest. It was her mind. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 2.5 centuries to bother learning the Egyptian language. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for 250 years without learning the language of the people they governed. They conducted their affairs in Greek, leaving the translation to intermediaries. Cleopatra did not want intermediaries. She learned Egyptian. Not just Egyptian, in fact. Ancient sources credit her with speaking 9 languages. Greek, her native tongue. Egyptian, the language of her subjects; Latin, the language of Rome, the empire that was increasingly dominating the Mediterranean world; Aramaic, the language of the eastern trade routes; Hebrew, Ethiopian, the language of the Medes; Parthian, and the language of the Troglodytes, a people of the Red Sea coast. 9 languages. In a world before language schools or recorded audio, learned from tutors and texts and direct conversation with native speakers brought to the palace. This linguistic ability was not merely a cultural achievement. It was a political superpower. When Cleopatra spoke to an Egyptian priest, she spoke to him in his own language. When she received Jewish merchants, she spoke in Hebrew. When Roman officials came to her court, she met them in Latin. The psychological impact of a queen who spoke your language, who met you in your own tongue rather than requiring you to come to hers, was profound. It said something about her, that she had taken the time to learn you, that she considered you worth that effort. It was the most sophisticated form of diplomacy. Beyond language, Cleopatra received an education appropriate to the ruler of the most intellectually sophisticated city in the ancient world. She studied mathematics and astronomy at a time when Alexandria was the center of both disciplines. She studied philosophy, the Stoic and Epicurean schools that dominated educated Greek thought. She studied medicine and later wrote or compiled texts on cosmetics and poisons that were referenced by later authors. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, that most essential political skill. She studied military strategy and the history of the kingdoms and empires that surrounded her. She needed to understand Egypt's place in the world. And Egypt's place in the world was increasingly precarious. Rome was everywhere now. Rome had absorbed Greece and Macedonia and most of the eastern Mediterranean. Rome controlled the trade routes that Egypt depended on. Rome had client relationships with most of the kings and queens of the region. Egypt was the last truly independent major power in the eastern Mediterranean, and its independence was maintained not by military strength alone, but by a combination of its enormous agricultural wealth, the grain that fed Rome, and the diplomatic skill of its rulers. Cleopatra understood this from her earliest education. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on managing Rome, not resisting it, not submitting to it, managing it, finding the right Romans to ally with, using Egypt's wealth and her own intelligence and charm as tools of foreign policy. She began learning these tools as a child. She practiced them in the complex, dangerous world of the Ptolemaic court, a world of siblings who would gladly see her dead if it meant they could take the throne, a world where poison in a wine cup was a real political option, a world where the wrong alliance or the wrong insult could mean exile or death. By the time she came to the throne at 18, she had been preparing for it her whole life. The palace corridors are quiet now. The oil lamps have burned down to their last flicker. Somewhere in the library wing, a young princess is still reading by the light of a lamp, still learning, still preparing for a world that will ask everything of her. As you rest now, quietly and warmly, the lamp burns low. We move forward. Chapter 3: The Throne of Egypt. A queen fights for her crown. Time period: 51-48 BC. Key figure: Cleopatra 7 and Ptolemy 13. Major event: the sibling civil war for the Egyptian throne. What was lost and regained? Everything. The death of Ptolemy 12 and 51 BC left the throne of Egypt to 2 of his children. Cleopatra 7, 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy 13, 10 years old. They were supposed to rule together as co-regents. This was the Ptolemaic tradition. Brother and sister, co-rulers, often married to each other in the Egyptian style. The idea was to keep power within the family. In practice, it usually meant that one sibling tried to eliminate the other. Cleopatra moved quickly to establish herself as the dominant partner. She was 18 to his 10. She was educated, prepared, fluent in 9 languages. He was a child managed by ambitious advisors. But those advisors were the problem. 3 men, Pothinus the eunuch, Achilles the general, and Theodotus the rhetoric teacher, formed a regency council around the young king. They were intelligent, ruthless, and determined to rule Egypt themselves through the child. Cleopatra was an obstacle. For 3 years, she ruled alongside her brother while the court factions maneuvered against her. She issued decrees in her own name alone, which was bold. She conducted foreign policy without consulting the council. She demonstrated, at every opportunity, that she was the real ruler. The council eventually moved against her. Around 48 BC, Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria. Her brother's faction had the army. She fled to Syria. But Cleopatra was not finished. She was never finished. From Syria, she began raising her own army. She recruited soldiers. She gathered resources. She prepared to fight her way back to her throne. By the summer of 48 BC, she had assembled a small army and was encamped at the border of Egypt, facing her brother's forces at Pelusium. A stalemate. 2 siblings with armies, glaring at each other across the sand, neither strong enough to destroy the other. And then the world shifted. Because Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He had been chasing his enemy Pompey across the Mediterranean. Pompey, defeated at Pharsalus, had fled to Egypt seeking refuge. He arrived at the Egyptian court and was immediately murdered. The boy king's advisors made the decision quickly. Pompey was finished. Caesar had won. Better to give Caesar Pompey's head and hope for Roman goodwill. They were wrong about Caesar's reaction. He was horrified. Pompey had been his son-in-law once. His rival, yes. His enemy, yes. But a Roman senator and general of the highest rank. He deserved better than a knife on a beach. Caesar wept when he was shown the head. And then he marched into Alexandria and took up residence in the royal palace. He was 52 years old. Technically, he had come to Egypt to collect a debt. Ptolemy XII had borrowed an enormous sum from Rome years earlier. Caesar intended to collect it. But events were about to take a very different turn, because Cleopatra needed to meet Caesar. And Cleopatra had to find a way into the palace past her brother's guards, who would kill her on sight. The solution she found has become one of the most famous stories in history. Though ancient accounts vary in their details, the most celebrated version describes Cleopatra being smuggled into the palace rolled inside a large sack or piece of bedding, carried through the palace gates by a single trusted servant, delivered directly to Caesar's private quarters, where she emerged and introduced herself. Caesar was captivated, immediately and completely. Whether it was the audacity of the entrance, or her intelligence, or her beauty, or her political power, or all of these things combined, we cannot know precisely. But the alliance between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra VII began that night, and it would change the ancient world. The palace is very quiet now. The harbor lights flicker on the dark water outside the window. A single lamp burns in the private room, and history is being made, quietly and completely, in the warm Mediterranean night. As you rest now, the ancient city sleeps around you. We move forward. Chapter 4: Caesar and Cleopatra, Power and Alliance. Time period: 48-44 BC. Key figure: Julius Caesar and Cleopatra VII. Major event: the alliance between Rome's greatest general and Egypt's queen. What was created? A political and personal partnership that shook the world. The relationship between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra was not simply a love affair. It was one of the most significant political alliances of the ancient world. Caesar was the most powerful man in Rome. Rome was the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt. Egypt was the richest country in the world. Their alliance made each of them stronger, and it made the world pay attention. But before the alliance could be secured, there was a war to fight. When the people of Alexandria realized that Caesar intended to support Cleopatra's claim to the throne over her brother, they rose up. The Alexandrian War, as it is called, was a brutal urban conflict fought street by street through the narrow alleys of the city. Caesar found himself besieged in the royal palace with a relatively small force. During the fighting, fire broke out near the harbor. Ancient sources suggest the Library of Alexandria, or part of it, may have been damaged or destroyed in this fire. The loss, if true, was one of the great cultural catastrophes of the ancient world. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of ancient civilization, turned to ash. Though historians debate exactly what was lost and when, Caesar held out in the palace through the winter. Reinforcements arrived in the spring of 47 BC. He defeated the forces of Ptolemy XIII at the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Some said the weight of his golden armor pulled him down. Cleopatra was queen. Caesar stayed in Egypt for months after the war ended. Together, he and Cleopatra sailed up the Nile on a magnificent royal barge. They traveled deep into Egypt, past the great temples of Luxor and Karnak, past the Valley of the Kings, past the ancient monuments of a civilization 3,000 years old. Caesar had never seen anything like it. Rome was 800 years old. The monuments they were sailing past were 2,000 years old when Rome was founded. The scale and the age of Egypt left an impression even on a man as unimpressed by most things as Julius Caesar. Cleopatra gave birth to a son around this time. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. The Alexandrians, with their gift for nicknames, called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar formally acknowledged the boy as his son is debated. He never publicly claimed him. Roman law and Roman politics made such an acknowledgement complicated. Caesar had a Roman wife. He had Roman political enemies who would use any personal impropriety against him. But he did not deny the child. And he left Egypt in the spring of 47 BC, taking with him something more valuable than the debt he had come to collect. A vision of what a ruler could be. A vision that would influence the way he governed Rome for the remaining years of his life. Cleopatra followed Caesar to Rome in 46 BC. She settled in a villa outside the city, nominally as a guest and foreign ally of the Roman state. In reality, she was Caesar's partner. Rome was uncomfortable with this. Roman society had strong ideas about the proper role of women. A foreign queen with obvious influence over Rome's most powerful man was threatening. She was mocked, criticized, talked about, called a whore and a witch and worse. None of it moved her. She had survived a civil war and a palace coup and an armed siege. Roman gossip was manageable. She was in Rome when the Ides of March came. When Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate. When the man she had allied herself with, the most powerful man in the world, bled to death at the base of Pompey's statue. She left Rome quickly. She had Caesarion with her. She understood immediately what the death of Caesar meant. The alliance that had secured her throne was gone. The protection of Rome's greatest general was gone. Everything she had built on that alliance was suddenly precarious. She sailed back to Egypt. She would need to find another Roman, and she would find the right one. In the most unforgettable entrance in the history of diplomacy. The river is dark and quiet tonight. The great barge rests at its moorings. The purple sails are furled. The silver oars are still. And Cleopatra is planning. Always planning. As you rest now, warm and still, history moves quietly around you. We move forward. Chapter 5. The Meeting on the Cydnus, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Time period, 41 BC. Key figure, Mark Antony and Cleopatra 7. Major event, the famous meeting at Tarsus. What began? The greatest love story of the ancient world. After Caesar's death, Rome divided. His heir Octavian, his lieutenant Mark Antony, and a general named Lepidus formed the second triumvirate. They divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west. Antony took the east. Lepidus took North Africa for a while. Mark Antony was responsible for the eastern provinces, for the kingdom of kings, as the East was sometimes called, for the trade routes and the client kings and the enormous wealth that flowed from Asia into Rome, and for the management of Egypt. Egypt, which was the richest country in the world. Egypt, which had been allied with Caesar. Egypt, whose queen had borne Caesar a son and was now, after the chaos of the post-assassination period, carefully navigating the new Roman political landscape. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey. He sent a message. She should come and explain her conduct during the recent civil wars. Which side had she been on? What support had she given to Caesar's assassins? She would come and account for herself before Rome's man in the East. Cleopatra's response to this summons is one of the great moments in the history of political theater. She kept him waiting, not for a day or two. She kept him waiting for months. She was making a point. Rome needed Egypt's grain more than Egypt needed any one Roman's goodwill. She was a queen. She came when she was ready. And when she finally came, she came in a manner that no one who saw it ever forgot. The Greek writer Plutarch, writing about a century and a half after the events, describes the scene in extraordinary detail. She came sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with a gilded stern. Its purple sails were spread, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were of silver, which to the sound of flutes, pipes, lutes, and other instruments, kept stroke in rowing. She herself lay under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a picture, and beautiful young boys, like painted cupids, stood on each side to fan her. Her maids were like sea nymphs and graces, some steering at the rudder, some working at the ropes. An incredible sweetness of perfume was wafted ashore from great numbers of incense burners. The people of Tarsus poured out of the city to the riverside to watch. The marketplace was deserted. Mark Antony sat alone at his tribunal in the public square. Everyone had gone to see the queen. Plutarch adds that the rumor spread through the crowd that Venus had come to revel with Bacchus for the happiness of Asia. Venus meeting Bacchus, the goddess of love meeting the god of wine and revelry. It was not an accidental image. Cleopatra had chosen it deliberately. Mark Antony was known for his love of wine and spectacle. He was known for his identification with Bacchus and Hercules. Cleopatra had studied her audience. She had prepared a performance perfectly tailored to the man she was about to meet. Antony sent a message inviting her to dinner. She replied that he should come to her instead. He came. The dinner she had prepared was legendary. Thousands of lights arranged in elaborate patterns. Food and wine of extraordinary variety and quality. Entertainment of every kind. Antony, a man not easily impressed by luxury after years in Rome and the East, was reportedly dazzled. The alliance that Cleopatra needed was secured not in a throne room, but over a dinner table. Not through formal negotiation, but through the most sophisticated personal diplomacy. And it quickly became something more than an alliance. Mark Antony was captivated. Whether this was love or admiration or political calculation on both their parts, or all of these things, the ancient world was not sure. It is still not sure. But whatever it was real. Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC there. They formed a group they called the Society of Inimitable Livers, an elite circle of friends who competed in staging the most extraordinary dinners and entertainments and experiences. They wandered the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise, playing pranks on the citizens. They hunted and fished and raced and feasted. For one winter, in the most magnificent city in the world, Mark Antony set aside the weight of the Roman world and simply lived, as fully and richly as he knew how. The Alexandria night is warm and soft. The harbor lights are golden on the dark water. Music drifts from the palace. The smell of flowers and incense, and the sea is everywhere. And somewhere in the warm city, a queen and a Roman general are laughing. As you rest now, deeply and warmly, the ancient night holds you. We move forward. Chapter 6: Kingdoms and Children, Building an Empire Together. Time period: 40-34 BC. Key figure: Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and their children. Major event: the donations of Alexandria. What was dreamed? A new kind of empire. The winter ended. Antony returned to Rome. He married Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a political settlement between the two men. Cleopatra was left in Alexandria. She was pregnant with Antony's children. She gave birth to twins. A boy she named Alexander Helios. The sun. A girl she named Cleopatra Selene. The moon. The sun and the moon. The children of the most powerful woman in the world and the most powerful man in the East. Named for the celestial bodies that govern the ancient world's sense of time and fate. Antony stayed away for 3 years. He was managing Rome and its politics and his uneasy relationship with Octavian. But the East kept pulling him back. He needed Egypt's wealth. He was planning a major military campaign against Parthia, the great empire to the east that Rome could never quite conquer. He needed money and grain and ships. Only one person could provide them at the scale he required. He returned to Cleopatra in 37 BC. He never left. He had a third child with her, a boy named Ptolemy Philadelphus, and he began to act less like a Roman general and more like an Eastern king. He wore Eastern dress at formal occasions. He honored the Egyptian gods. He began to identify himself with the god Dionysus, the same identification Cleopatra had played upon at their first meeting on the Cydnus. He was becoming, in the eyes of Rome, uncomfortably un-Roman. His Parthian campaign was a partial success and a partial disaster. He advanced deep into Parthian territory and then was forced to retreat under terrible conditions. Thousands of his soldiers died in the retreat. But Cleopatra met him with food and supplies and money and clothing for his shattered army. She saved what could be saved. In 34 BC, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria that is called the Donations of Alexandria. In the great gymnasium of the city, before an enormous crowd, he sat on a golden throne with Cleopatra beside him. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings. He gave Egypt and Cyprus to her and to Caesar Ion, whom he acknowledged as Caesar's legitimate son and heir to Caesar's legacy. He gave their children kingdoms. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and Parthia, kingdoms not yet conquered but claimed. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. It was an extraordinary act. A Roman official distributing Roman-controlled territories as personal gifts to an Egyptian queen and her children. Rome was furious. Octavian was livid. And Octavian was a man who knew exactly how to use political fury as a weapon. He read Antony's will in public. A private document, read aloud in the Senate, revealing that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome. In Alexandria, beside his Egyptian queen. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. A Roman choosing burial in Egypt over burial in Rome. A Roman whose loyalty was clearly to a foreign queen over his own country. Octavian declared war. Not on Antony, technically. On Cleopatra. on the foreign queen who had seduced Rome's general, on the Eastern menace to Roman values and Roman supremacy. The war everyone had been expecting was finally coming. The throne room is very quiet now. The golden thrones stand empty in the lamplight. The crowds have gone home. The children are asleep in their royal beds. And in the distance, from the west, the sound of Roman legions marching grows louder. Day by day, month by month, closer. As you rest now, breathing slowly, deeply, the ancient world holds its breath. We move forward. Chapter 7, Actium, the battle that decided the world. Time period, 32-31 BC. Key figure, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. Major event, the Battle of Actium. What was decided? Who would rule the world? The summer of 31 BC. The western coast of Greece. A promontory called Actium, where a bay opens to the Ionian Sea. Two fleets face each other across the water. On one side, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Marcus Agrippa. On the other, the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The armies that stand behind these fleets are also enormous. Antony has perhaps 100,000 soldiers and 500 ships. Octavian has approximately 80,000 soldiers and 400 ships. On paper, Antony's forces are larger, but paper does not win battles. The months before the battle had not gone well for Antony. Disease had swept through his army, camped in the malarial coastal lowlands. Key allies had defected to Octavian. Antony's officers had begun arguing among themselves about strategy. And there was a deeper problem. Cleopatra's presence with the army was deeply controversial among Antony's Roman officers. A Roman general fighting alongside an Egyptian queen, fighting what was essentially a civil war against other Romans. It did not sit well with many of Antony's men. Several of his most trusted officers defected, taking with them detailed knowledge of his plans and weaknesses. When battle came on September 2nd, 31 BC, it did not go well for Antony. The fighting at sea was fierce and confused. And then, in the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian ships turned and sailed south, away from the battle. The ancient sources disagree violently on why. Some say she panicked and fled. Some say it was planned, a deliberate retreat to preserve Egypt's fleet and treasury. Some say she received a false signal that the battle was lost. What we know is that she sailed, and Antony, seeing her sails disappearing to the south, left his flagship and followed her. He left his fleet. He left his army. He sailed after Cleopatra. His army, leaderless, eventually surrendered to Octavian. His fleet, abandoned, was eventually defeated or surrendered. The war was over. Octavian had won. The ancient world had a new master. His name was Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, and he would not be sharing it with anyone. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria. They had lost everything except Egypt itself, and Egypt would not hold out long against the victorious Octavian. The sea at Actium is very still tonight. The promontory is dark and quiet. The water that ran red with blood and burning ships is smooth and black and ancient. Nothing here now but the sound of the waves, and the stars, and the long memory of a day that changed everything. As you breathe slowly now, and rest, we move forward into the final chapter. Chapter 8, Alexandria's Last Days, the End of a Queen. Time period, 31-30 BC. Key figure, Cleopatra 7. Major event, the fall of Alexandria and the death of Cleopatra. What ended? 3,000 years of Egyptian royal history. After Actium, Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria knowing what was coming. Octavian was marching east. He had all of Rome's resources behind him. He had the loyalty of the armies and the navies. He had the moral authority of the Roman Senate. He was unstoppable. But Cleopatra was not ready to give up. She never simply gave up. She began the most extraordinary diplomatic effort of her career. She sent messages to Octavian. She offered him treasure. She offered him political cooperation. She offered him anything she had, if only he would spare Egypt and allow her son Caesarion to inherit the throne. She was negotiating with the only currency she had left, Egypt's wealth and her own intelligence, and the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power. She also began to prepare for the alternative. She gathered treasure into the great mausoleum she had begun building near the Temple of Isis. Gold and silver and emeralds and pearls, ebony and ivory, spices and flammable materials. If Octavian would not deal with her, she would burn it all rather than let it be carried through the streets of Rome in a triumph. And she explored another option. She experimented with poisons, testing them, the ancient sources say, on prisoners and slaves, looking for the most painless and quickest. She was thorough. She was methodical. Even in desperation, she was precise. Antony made one last military effort. A brief, gallant, hopeless cavalry sortie outside the walls of Alexandria. He drove back Octavian's forces for a day, but it changed nothing. The sea change came when his fleet surrendered to Octavian without a fight, and then his land forces went over as well. Antony, receiving a false report that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword. He did not die immediately. He lingered, and then he was told that Cleopatra was in fact alive in her mausoleum. His servants carried the dying man to the mausoleum. Cleopatra would not open the doors. She feared a trap. He was hauled up through a window. He died in her arms. The man who had been, for a decade, the most powerful Roman in the Eastern world, died in the mausoleum of his queen, in Alexandria, as he had always wanted. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's forces shortly after. She was brought before Octavian. She was 39 years old. The ancient sources describe the meeting in various ways. Some say she tried to seduce him. Some say she made a formal political submission. What all agree on is that Octavian was polite and made vague, reassuring statements about her future, and that Cleopatra did not believe him. She had enough experience with powerful men to know when she was being managed. She knew what Octavian intended. He intended to take her to Rome. He intended to parade her through the streets in chains, as the defeated foreign queen, as the embodiment of Eastern decadence and Roman triumph, as a symbol of what Rome had overcome. She had seen Caesar's triumph. She knew what it looked like. She was not going to be part of Octavian's. On August 12th, 30 BC, Cleopatra prepared carefully. She bathed and dressed in her finest clothes. She ate a meal. She sent a letter to Octavian asking to be buried beside Antony. And then, the method of her death has been debated for 2,000 years. The most famous version involves an asp, the Egyptian cobra, the symbol of royal power and divine protection, brought to her in a basket of figs. She was found dead with 2 small marks on her arm. Her 2 handmaidens were also dead or dying. One of them, barely alive when Octavian's men broke in, was asked whether this was well done. She is reported to have replied, "It is very well, and befitting a descendant of so many kings." Octavian was frustrated. He had been outwitted. He had wanted her alive for his triumph. She had denied him that. She was 39 years old. She had been queen of Egypt for 21 years. She had allied herself with 2 of the most powerful men in the world. She had fought for her throne and for Egypt with every resource she possessed. She had spoken 9 languages. She had understood medicine and mathematics and philosophy and military strategy. She had charmed and outmaneuvered and outthought most of the people she dealt with. And in the end, she had chosen the manner of her death with the same care and precision that she had brought to everything else in her life. Octavian buried her beside Antony, as she had requested. The tomb has never been found. After more than 2,000 years of searching, Cleopatra keeps her last secret. She is somewhere beneath the streets of modern Alexandria, or somewhere in the desert outside the city, or somewhere the sea has swallowed, as the ancient coastline has shifted and sunk over the centuries. She is still there, still waiting, still keeping one thing to herself. The mausoleum is very quiet tonight. The harbor lights of Alexandria flicker on the dark water. The lighthouse beam sweeps slowly across the sea. And somewhere beneath the ancient city, the last queen of Egypt sleeps. As you sleep now, deeply and peacefully, history holds you gently. We move forward into what came after. Chapter 9. After Cleopatra, Egypt becomes Roman. Time period, 30 BC, 4th century AD. Key figure, Octavian Augustus. Major event, Egypt absorbed into the Roman Empire. What changed? The last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean. With Cleopatra's death, 3,000 years of Egyptian royal history ended. Not with a great battle, not with a dramatic siege, but with a woman in her finest clothes, lying on a golden couch, refusing, to the last, to be anyone's trophy. Octavian entered Alexandria. He visited the tomb of Alexander the Great. He was offered the opportunity to see the tombs of the Ptolemaic kings. He declined. He had come to see a king, he said, not a row of corpses. He ordered Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, killed. He was 17. He was the last of the Ptolemaic line, and he was the son of Caesar. Octavian, who derived his own authority from his adoption by Caesar, could not afford to have another Caesar's son alive. 2 Caesars is too many, an advisor reportedly told him. Caesarion was found in Upper Egypt and killed. The other children, Antony's children with Cleopatra, were taken to Rome. Alexander Helios, the sun; Cleopatra Selene, the moon; Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, in chains of gold rather than iron, a concession to their royal blood, but paraded nonetheless. Cleopatra Selene, the eldest, survived. She was eventually married to the king of Mauritania in what is now Morocco. She became Queen Cleopatra Selene too. She ruled wisely and well. She named her son Ptolemy. The royal blood continued. In a different land, under a different sky, Egypt itself became a Roman province, but a very special one. Augustus was so concerned about Egypt's strategic importance, its grain, its wealth, its position on the trade routes, that he made it a personal imperial possession. No Roman senator was allowed to enter Egypt without the emperor's personal permission. Egypt was the emperor's private country. Its grain fed Rome. Its wealth funded the treasury. Its position on the trade routes to India and Arabia made it the most economically important province in the empire. Egypt was too valuable to share. The Egyptian people experienced the change from Ptolemaic to Roman rule relatively smoothly. The administration continued. The temples were maintained. The old religions persisted. Roman emperors, like the Ptolemies before them, presented themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian religious contexts. Images of Augustus and later emperors in pharaonic style can be found on Egyptian temple walls. The ancient religious traditions of Egypt continued for centuries under Roman rule. The great temple complex at Philae, dedicated to the goddess Isis, remained a functioning pagan religious site until the 6th century AD. The very last hieroglyphic inscription dates from 394 AD, more than 400 years after the death of Cleopatra. The old language held on. The old gods held on. Egypt absorbed its conquerors as it had always absorbed its conquerors, taking what was useful, maintaining what mattered, surviving. The Nile moves quietly tonight. The ancient temples stand in the warm dark. The hieroglyphs are silent on their walls, and the last queen of Egypt is still somewhere beneath her city. Still there, still present. As you are present now, warm and resting and real, we move forward into the story of what Cleopatra became after her death. Chapter 10. The Legend: How Cleopatra Conquered History. Time period: 30 BC to the present. Key figure: Cleopatra as a cultural figure. Major event: the creation of the Cleopatra legend. What was made? The most enduring female image in Western culture. Cleopatra died in 30 BC, but in many ways, she has never stopped living. The legend of Cleopatra began almost immediately after her death. The Roman poet Horace wrote about her within a decade. He called her a mad queen who planned the destruction of the capital, a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster. But even in the act of condemning her, he gave her a kind of grudging respect. He noted that she did not fear the sword and did not seek distant shores with her swift fleet. She chose death with a serene face. She handled the rough asps with her calm hands. Even Rome's propagandists could not quite destroy her dignity. Plutarch, writing about 150 years after her death, gave us the most detailed ancient account of her life. His portrait is remarkably nuanced for an ancient text. He notes that her beauty was not so absolutely unrivaled that it would strike you with amazement at first sight. What captivated those who spent time with her was the charm of her conversation, the force of her personality, the music of her voice, the intelligence that informed every exchange. He writes that she made you feel, when she spoke to you, that you were the only person in the world worth speaking to. Shakespeare immortalized her in his play Antony and Cleopatra, written in 1606. Age cannot wither her, says Enobarbus, nor custom stale her infinite variety. It is one of the most famous descriptions of a human being in the English language, and it captures something the ancient sources also suggest, that what was extraordinary about Cleopatra was not any single quality. It was the combination, the constant renewal, the sense that there was always something more, something new, something you had not yet understood about her. Infinite variety. The arts have never stopped returning to her. George Frederick Handel wrote an opera about Julius Caesar and Cleopatra in 1724. Sarah Bernhardt played her on stage in the 19th century. Theda Bara played her in one of the first great Hollywood productions in 1917, a film now almost entirely lost. Claudette Colbert played her in 1934. Elizabeth Taylor played her in the most expensive film ever made up to that point, in 1963. Each generation has remade her in its own image. Each actress has brought something of herself to the role, because there is enough in the historical record to support many different interpretations. The seductress, the politician, the mother, the philosopher, the warrior, the victim, the victor. She contains all of them, and she eludes all of them, because the real Cleopatra is still lost somewhere under the streets of Alexandria, still keeping her secrets. Modern Egyptologists and archaeologists continue to search for her tomb. Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican archaeologist, has been excavating a site near Alexandria called Tapisaris Magna for years. She has found extraordinary things: coins bearing Cleopatra's image, a marble head that may be Antony, tunnels and chambers that suggest a site of major ritual significance. She has not yet found the tomb, but she has not stopped looking, because Cleopatra is worth finding, because she still has something to tell us about power and intelligence and survival and identity, about what it means to be a woman in a world that underestimates you, about what it means to fight for what you believe is yours to the last possible moment, about dignity, about refusing, even in the worst moments, to be defined by other people's stories about you. The desert night is warm and very still. The The stars above Alexandria are the same stars that shone on Cleopatra's city. The sea moves quietly against the ancient shore. And somewhere below, in the warm dark, the last queen of Egypt is still there. Still present. Still herself. Still waiting to be found. As you rest now, still and warm in yourself, history holds you gently. We move forward into the final chapter of our story. Chapter 11. Who was she really? Cleopatra beyond the legend. Time period: 69-30 BC. Throughout her life. Key figure: the historical Cleopatra. Major event: reassessing the real woman behind the legend. What we find: a human being of extraordinary complexity. 2,000 years of storytelling have done something to Cleopatra. They have made her into a symbol. The seductress, the femme fatale, the beautiful, dangerous foreign woman who destroyed Roman men. This image was created largely by her enemies, by the Roman propagandists who worked for Octavian, by a culture that was deeply uncomfortable with female power, by centuries of writers and artists who found the idea of a beautiful, dangerous woman more interesting than the reality of a skilled, determined ruler. The real Cleopatra was more interesting than all of them. She was, first and foremost, a ruler, a working head of state who governed a complex, wealthy, multicultural country for 21 years. She managed the economy of Egypt during a period of significant stress. She dealt with famines and floods and political crises. She maintained the loyalty of her people through careful attention to their religious traditions and their material needs. She was a diplomat of the highest order. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not simply personal. They were the central elements of her foreign policy. She was using the tools available to her in a world where women could not command armies personally, could not sit in the Roman Senate, could not exercise formal political power within the Roman system. She used what she had: her intelligence, her charm, her political relationships, her country's enormous wealth, and she used them with extraordinary skill for 21 years. The ancient sources, mostly hostile, still cannot quite hide their respect for her. They call her dangerous and scheming and immoral, but they also describe her courage, her intelligence, her refusal to be diminished, her dignity in defeat. These are not the qualities of a woman whose only weapon was her beauty. There is also the question of her appearance. The ancient sources are clear that her physical beauty was not her most remarkable quality. Plutarch says it explicitly. The coins that bear her image show a strong-featured woman with a prominent nose and a commanding expression. Not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the idealized portraits of the period, but striking, powerful-looking, a face that commands attention. The image of Cleopatra as the most beautiful woman in the world was largely a creation of later centuries, of painters who idealized her, of Hollywood who cast its most glamorous stars in the role. The real Cleopatra's power was not her face. It was her mind, and the extraordinary, relentless will that drove her from the age of 18 to the age of 39. From her first assumption of the throne, through the civil war with her brother, through the alliance with Caesar, through his assassination and her flight from Rome, through the years of building with Antony, through the loss at Actium, through the final desperate months in Alexandria. She never stopped. She never gave up. She never surrendered on anyone else's terms. She chose her own terms. To the end. There is something in that which speaks across 2,000 years. A woman who refused to be anyone's object, who insisted, even in the worst moments, on being a subject, an agent, someone who acted rather than being acted upon, who chose, even when all the choices were terrible. The choice itself was hers. The night is very quiet now. The ancient world rests. The harbor of Alexandria is dark and still, and somewhere in it, the last pharaoh of Egypt keeps her final secret. As you keep your own quiet secrets in the warm dark, your breathing is slow and even. Your body is heavy and still. The ancient world is very close tonight, and very peaceful. We are nearly at the end of our journey. Chapter 12, Cleopatra's Children. What came after? Time period, 30 BC, 6 AD. Key figure, Cleopatra Selene II. Major event, the fate of Cleopatra's children. What survived? The royal bloodline, in a different land. 3 of Cleopatra's 4 children survived her. Caesar Ion, her son by Julius Caesar, was killed on Octavian's orders. He was the one who could not be allowed to live. The son of Caesar, living heir to Egypt, with a claim that could challenge Octavian's own. He was 17. His death was political, cold, calculated, necessary from Octavian's perspective, and terrible. But Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome. They were raised in the household of Octavia, Mark Antony's Roman wife. Cleopatra's children, raised by the wife of their father. It was, in its way, an act of grace on Octavia's part. Whatever she had suffered because of Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, she did not take it out on his children. She raised them carefully. She gave them an education. She gave them, as much as possible, stability. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the historical record relatively early. Whether they died young, or were simply not significant enough to be recorded, we do not know. But Cleopatra Selene survived. She was married to Juba II, the king of Mauritania, a Roman client kingdom in what is now Morocco and Algeria. Juba II was himself remarkable, an educated, sophisticated man who had also been taken to Rome as a child captive after his father's defeat. He was a scholar who wrote on history and geography and natural history. He and Cleopatra Selene ruled Mauritania together. They named their capital Caesarea after Caesar. They modeled their court on the sophistication of the Ptolemaic court. They collected art and manuscripts. They cultivated relationships with scholars and poets. They produced coins that bore their joint portraits. On those coins, Cleopatra Selene wears a crescent moon in her hair. The moon she was named for. Still there. Still carried. Across the sea from Egypt. In a different land. Under a different sky. She and Juba too had a son. They named him Ptolemy, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He ruled Mauritania after his parents. He was eventually murdered by the Emperor Caligula, reportedly out of jealousy over the beauty of his purple cloak. Caligula's cruelty took many forms. But with Ptolemy's death, the royal line of Egypt ended. The family that had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great finally came to its end. Not in Egypt, in a Roman prison, centuries after they had lost their kingdom. But they had survived. Cleopatra's daughter had survived, had built something, had created something, had kept the flame of the Ptolemaic tradition alive for another generation. In her own way, in her smaller kingdom by the Atlantic, Cleopatra Selene had done what her mother always did. She had found a way. The Atlantic wind moves gently over the ruins of Caesarea tonight. The ancient city is quiet. The moon is up. And somewhere in the warm dark, a queen's daughter is still carrying her mother's name forward. Still shining. The moon always shines. As you rest now, quietly and deeply and completely, we are coming to our end. Chapter 13. The Search for Cleopatra, Modern Discoveries. Time period, present day. Key figure, modern archaeologists. Major event, the ongoing search for Cleopatra's tomb. What is being found? The ancient world, still yielding its secrets. The search for Cleopatra's tomb is one of the great ongoing archaeological adventures of the modern world. Alexandria has changed enormously since her time. The ancient harbor has been partially submerged as the coastline shifted over centuries. buildings and monuments that Cleopatra knew have been buried under 2,000 years of construction. The sea has swallowed parts of the ancient royal quarter. Underwater archaeologists have found extraordinary things in the harbor. Sphinxes and obelisks and statues resting on the bottom of the Mediterranean. The remnants of the lighthouse, collapsed into the sea by earthquakes. Columns and capitals from buildings that Cleopatra walked past. These underwater ruins give us a sense of the scale and beauty of the ancient city, and they remind us how much has been lost. On land, the search continues at Taposiris Magna. This ancient temple complex, dedicated to Osiris and Isis, sits on the Mediterranean coast west of Alexandria. Kathleen Martinez has been excavating there for years. She has found evidence of a significant royal presence at the site. Coins with Cleopatra's image, statuary, an elaborate tunnel system deep in the rock, chambers that may have served ritual purposes. She believes Cleopatra may have chosen to be buried at Taposiris Magna rather than in Alexandria itself. At a site sacred to Isis, the goddess Cleopatra identified herself with throughout her reign. At a site removed from the city that Octavian had taken. In 2022, Martinez announced the discovery of a tunnel beneath the temple site, carved from the living rock, extending toward the sea, lined with extraordinary precision. The tunnel has not yet been fully explored. What lies at its end is not yet known. The search goes on, and it matters, not just for historical knowledge, though that matters enormously. It matters because Cleopatra deserves to be found on her own terms, not through the Roman accounts that mostly portrayed her as a dangerous foreign seductress, not through the artistic tradition that reimagined her beauty across 2,000 years, but through the physical evidence, through the objects she touched, the buildings she commissioned, the tomb she prepared with such care. Finding her tomb would give us something direct, something that bypassed the stories and the propaganda, something that said, simply, here she was, here she rested. This is where the last pharaoh of Egypt came to her end. And it would say something more. It would say that she endured, that she lasted, that even after 2,000 years of searching and building and destruction and sea level change and earthquake and time, she is still there, still present, still herself. The Mediterranean night is very warm. The sea moves quietly against the ancient shore. Somewhere below the surface, the ancient world rests, still beautiful, still full of secrets, still waiting to be found. As you rest now, deeply, completely, full of your own secrets, your own beauty, your own enduring presence in this ancient world, we have come to our last chapter. Chapter 14, What Cleopatra Means, Her Legacy Across Time. Time period, 30 BC to the present. Key figure, Cleopatra as idea and symbol. Major event, the transformation of Cleopatra into a cultural force. What endures? A woman who refused to be forgotten. What does Cleopatra mean? After 2,000 years of stories and paintings and plays and films and novels and debates, what does she actually mean? She means different things to different people. To some, she is the eternal femme fatale, the dangerous woman who uses her beauty and sexuality as weapons, who destroys the men she touches. This image was invented by her enemies and has been enthusiastically promoted by a culture that has always been somewhat uncomfortable with female power. To others, she is the ultimate political strategist, a woman who survived in a world that gave her no legitimate political power over the men who held Rome's armies, who used every tool available to her, including personal relationships, to pursue her political goals, who was not destroyed by the men she loved, but who chose them deliberately for reasons of state. To others still, she is the scholar and intellectual, the woman who spoke 9 languages, who wrote or compiled texts on medicine and cosmetics, who governed a country while engaging seriously with the philosophical and scientific questions of her age, who made Alexandria's great intellectual tradition her own. To others, she is the mother, the woman who bore 4 children in a world where childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous, who tried, to the end, to preserve her throne for her son Caesarion, whose last concern was for the fate of her children after her death. To others, she is the Egyptian, the pharaoh who spoke her subjects' language, who honored their gods, who fought to maintain Egypt's independence against the overwhelming power of Rome, who failed, ultimately, but who delayed the inevitable for 2 decades through sheer intelligence and force of will. All of these Cleopatras are real. They are all present in the ancient sources. They are all true, and they are all inadequate, because the real Cleopatra was a human being. Complex, contradictory, driven and afraid, brilliant and vulnerable, capable of extraordinary things, and also just a woman living through extraordinary circumstances. She had parents she lost. She had siblings who tried to kill her. She had children she loved fiercely. She had relationships that were both political and personal, as all human relationships are. She had fears and hopes and private sorrows that no ancient source bothered to record. She was alone with her thoughts, somewhere, every night of her life. Just as you are alone with yours tonight. Just as every human being who has ever lived has been alone with their thoughts in the dark. This is what history gives us, at its best. Not just facts and dates and names, but the sense that the people of the past were real, were human, were as complicated and frightened and hopeful and determined as we are. Cleopatra was all of those things. She was a woman who lived in a world that underestimated her, and spent her entire adult life proving the world wrong. She has been proving it wrong ever since. For 2,000 years, she is still proving it. In every story we tell about her, in every search for her tomb, in every time someone picks up the historical record and tries to understand who she really was underneath the legend, she endures, the last queen of Egypt, still refusing to be forgotten, still keeping her secrets, still, somewhere under the warm Mediterranean earth, waiting to be found. We have come to the end of our journey tonight. You have traveled a long way. From the harbor of Alexandria 2,000 years ago, from the golden ship on the river Cydnus, from the royal palace where a princess became a queen, from the battlefields and the banquets and the diplomatic meetings, from the libraries and the throne rooms and the mausoleum by the sea. You have spent this night with one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. And now it is time to rest. Your body knows it. It is heavy now. Deeply, completely heavy. Your arms rest at your sides. Your legs are still and warm. Your hands are open and relaxed. Your breathing is slow and even and deep. The Mediterranean night is very warm around you. The stars above Alexandria are thick and white and ancient. The same stars that Cleopatra watched from the deck of her golden barge. The same stars above the lighthouse of Alexandria, whose beams swept slowly across the dark sea. The same stars above the mausoleum where she made her final choice. They are above you tonight. The same ones. Still there. Still keeping their ancient patient watch. The harbor of Alexandria is very still. The water is dark and smooth as polished marble. The lighthouse is dark now, its fire long extinguished by the centuries. But the stars do its work for it, lighting the way, marking the path. The city sleeps around you. 2,000 years of building and changing and living above the bones of the ancient world. And beneath all of it, beneath the streets and the traffic and the modern noise and the centuries of accumulated life, the ancient city is still there, still present, still holding its secrets, as you hold yours, in the warm dark. Your breathing is very slow now. Your mind is growing quiet. The thoughts that were moving through it are settling now, like dust after a long day. drifting down, coming to rest. The last queen of Egypt rests beneath her city. The golden ship is still on its dark water. The purple sails have furled. The silver oars are quiet. And the perfume that once drifted across the water to the waiting crowd is only a memory now. A beautiful, ancient memory, carried forward by the stories we tell, by the history we share, by nights like this one, when the past comes close and speaks its quiet truth. You are part of that story now. You have carried Cleopatra's name through this night. You have held her story, and in the morning, when you wake, something of her will still be with you, in the quiet way that all good stories stay with us. Carried forward, living on. The ancient world sleeps tonight. Egypt sleeps. Alexandria sleeps. The Mediterranean moves quietly in the warm dark. And you sleep now, deeply, peacefully, in the company of history. Good night.